So how many of you here are sort of tech leads or architects? Other sort of team leads, perhaps? Okay, and developers just in general? Okay, fantastic. So a little bit about myself. One interesting thing about this talk is, I guess, this book that I recently published called Talking Tech Leads. I have 3 copies to give away at the end for the first 3 who ask questions. But what's interesting about this book was talking to lots of different people who've made that transition from being a developer to a tech lead. And there's some really interesting insights about the challenges it is that people have when they go from writing code to suddenly leading a team of developers. And in this talk, I'm going to share some of my experiences of helping people make this transition from being a developer to being a tech lead or sort of an architect. If you want to talk to me after this thing, I'm happy to talk about the training program that we run inside our sort of organization about getting people from developers to tech leads, but that's not exactly what this talk is all about. So the first point I want to ask is, well, why do we need a tech lead? If we're all self-empowered developers who understand what that goal is, why do we need any of this? The simple explanation is that when you're working on your think about your own sort of project, it's just you and your idea. You have this goal at the end, but it's just you. And so you making your way to your goal, you don't really need to articulate what that point is. So you have this pretty clearly in your head. It gets a little bit more complicated when you add some more people into the mix. So we have maybe a team of 5 people. And so you say, we'd like to achieve this sort of goal by the end of some sort of time frame. And you think, well, okay, that's pretty easy. I've said it once. Everyone kind of knows, and they all sort of head towards that. So you think that everyone's sort of heading in the same direction. But in reality, what is actually happening is people hear that idea, and they have their own sort of interpretations of these things. So you might have some developers think that their idea is, this is an experiment to use the latest technology. We're going to use React for JavaScript, or we're going to learn Jasmine for testing. This is going to be the best TDD application that we're actually going to build. Whereas other people will be like, we're building this functionality for a particular user. And so what in reality happens is people go off in lots of different directions. And this leads to a bit of chaos, and probably a lot of frustration. And if you don't think that this happens in the real world, in my experience it happens quite frequently. And it's kind of summarized by a really nice tweet from an ex-colleague of mine called Julian, where he talks about, I had 10 guys in my last project, and all of them had opinions, and all of them were expressed in the code base. So imagine going into each part of the code, and you can sort of say, oh yeah, that was written by that person, and that was written by that person. And you have lots of different pockets of lots of different ways and different styles in this sort of code base. And for me, the simple test for being an effective tech lead is, does the code base look like it was written by a single person? So it's not always going to look exactly the same. Even us as developers, we're learning constantly, and our styles will evolve as we sort of get better at refactoring, as we discover more about the domain. But in general, are we moving the same sort of direction? And so this is kind of that key responsibility of that tech lead, of trying to keep everyone heading in that same sort of direction. And in this talk, I want to explore kind of 3 different dimensions of what you might think of as being an effective tech lead. So the first one is about, of course, the programming. So there has to be a technical side to this role, and there's a lot of responsibility. The next side is about the people. So we don't really lead a development team without having people on this team. And the third bit is around the process and understanding about how do we get people to work together. So we'll talk about sort of programming to begin with. So the first thing is, do tech leads need to code? And I would actually say, definitely. And then the next question you're probably all asking is, well, how much should you be coding? Now, I have a rule of thumb, it's not exact, but I'd sort of guess at about 30% of your time. So this kind of equates to maybe 1.5 days per week of actually trying to stay hands-on with the code. Obviously, if you can actually sort of spend more time in the code base, that's a lot better, because you're starting to get to understand what the current state of the code is, what the problems that people are actually facing. You can kind of actually understand what are the issues that people are talking about. If you can sort of spend, and of course this will actually change depending on what phase of the project that you're in. So if you're going through planning cycles, you'll probably spend a little bit less time in the code. But it's a nice way of sort of saying, am I spending enough time in general on the code base? And there's a really great article that describes why this is. So this is written by Jay Ello, and it's called The Unspoken Truth About Managing Geeks. And there's a couple of interesting things in this sort of article about why, as tech leads, we should code. So the first one is that in our sort of development realm, what we actually respect from people, and the people that we work with, is this idea of respect. And so as a lead, you want to have the respect of your peers, otherwise they're not really going to be working with you very effectively. And in this article, he continues to talk about what does respect mean when you're talking to a bunch of developers. Is it about authority? Is it about titles? No way. It's actually the amount of respect an IT pro pays someone is a measure of how tolerable they are to getting something done. And so this means how effective are you actually solving problems? How good are you at writing code? So if you can imagine yourself on a team where you're working with a tech lead, but they're talking about tools and frameworks which are not relevant to the problems that you're solving, you're thinking as a developer, you're just creating more problems for me, I'm going to lose trust and respect. And so this ability of understanding the code and the state of the code base, the technical debt, the issues that people face, it helps you empathize and build respect for that team, which is why it's important that we spend time in that code base. Other things a tech lead should be doing when they think about sort of code is really thinking about consistency over cleverness. So this is about sort of getting the team to think back into that, are we working as a single entity towards whatever our goal may be, and are we doing this in a sort of common manner? And so these are some of the arguments that when I've joined sort of development teams, I sort of see all the time. So there's things like, are we going to use tabs or spaces? If we're going to use spaces, it's 2 or 4 spaces. If you're doing Python, that's not a problem. Camel case or underscore. Brackets or no brackets, particularly on single lines. And curly braces at the end of line or not. So it's interesting because developers love to argue. I've been part of these myself, right? We get really passionate about the tools, about the reasons, and we can always come up with some justification for some stylistic thing. But the important thing as a tech lead is trying to understand where is the effort actually going. And it's great to get your developers to start thinking about the more important issues. So rather than thinking about these stylistic things and arguing over personal styles, how about we come up with a nice algorithm for sort of solving this business problem or coming up with a better way of scaling our software? These are the more important issues we should be channeling our sort of people on. And these are the things that developers will get a lot more satisfaction of rather than actually sort of getting their own personal style into the code base. And so we as sort of tech leads, our skill is in actually facilitating sort of discussions and conflicts so that people can actually spend their time on the more pressing technical issues. And so as a tech lead, when I'm thinking about how you lead a team, I'm thinking constantly about the sort of team culture, and particularly how that manifests it when your developers are approaching tasks in sort of every day. So some of the questions that are good to ask yourself if you're in this role, or you find yourself in this role, is if you're doing continuous integration, how long does the build stay broken? So if something breaks, is the habit of the team to sort of sit there and wait until somebody sort of goes around and goes, do you know what broke the build, or is somebody working on the build? Or is there a culture that says there's a red light that goes up and everyone sort of stops the line and goes and fixes that? And these are sort of team cultural questions that as tech leads we should be considering how we actually encourage. Do people avoid conflict? I actually believe that conflict is a healthy thing in normal teams. But where it becomes dangerous is where conflict doesn't get resolved. And this is where, as tech leads, we have to help our teams get through these conflicts. It's okay to have differing opinions, as long as we can find a way forward, so we can get all the different approaches out. Do people offer new ideas? So it's kind of a smell to me when teams don't actually talk about new tools and technologies, when people aren't sort of reading about other websites and sort of upcoming trends, and seeing if there's an appropriate fit for where we might use it on a project. And so, you know, we can't know about everything possibly in the world. We all have sort of different specialties and interests. And as a team, we can sort of tap into all those different interests. But it's only if people are actually going to bring them to the table. And as tech leads, we create that culture to allow people to bring new ideas in a safe environment. Do people flag when they need help? So whoever's been in a stand-up where it's been, you know, there's a story, it's almost done, it'll be done today. The next day, same stand-up, it's almost done, it'll be done today. And it sort of continues on and on. People aren't really talking about, you know, I need some help with this particular task because I'm good enough that I can take care of it myself. And so there's something about that team culture, particularly as a technical team culture, which is it's okay to say, I need some help, I don't know what I'm doing, and who could help me with this particular task? And do people feel okay to admit being wrong? So you as a leader can actually create this culture yourself by making sure that you admit when you're wrong as well. So these are all the things that as tech leads we should be thinking about. What's the sort of technical culture in our teams and how is that sort of being approached? The final thing I think that's really key from a programming perspective as a tech lead is thinking about your sort of vision. And this isn't necessarily about the business problem, because often that's kind of in the context of what a business we're working in, somebody else has kind of set that direction. But actually, what's our architectural vision? So one of my most favorite activities to do is actually to get a bunch of our developers in a room, give them either a whiteboard or a sort of piece of paper, and get people to draw their architecture. And then get people to demonstrate what's their understanding of the architecture and how different it can actually be. And this is actually a really great feedback mechanism for you as a tech lead to get an idea of how good is your vision being manifested by every person in that sort of team. Where there are differences, that's actually opportunities for helping people understand maybe where the gaps are in what your architectural vision is. But it's really important that people understand, are we going down a microservices route, or are we going down an MVC classical 3-tier application? It doesn't really matter as long as everyone has that good picture of what it is you're actually achieving. Can people talk about the same components and the same names? And do people understand why we have different applications in our sort of application architecture, depending on what it's trying to actually do? So the more that we can get people to sort of understand this, the better that they'll be informed when they're actually writing code on a day-to-day basis. So we've talked about the programming side. The second dimension to the tech lead is really thinking about the people side. And I have to say it's actually one of the most difficult parts. So as a developer, we generally only have to argue with our computer, right? So our compiler is not happy. This framework's giving us stack exceptions. But when it comes to people, we generally don't have lots of great practice with it. One of the key things that I've learned over time is actually appreciating differences. This is something that I think a lot of people have talked about sort of throughout this conference. And one of my favorite books around this is actually the Strengths Finder book. How many people have done this book or read this book? Okay. So the idea of Strengths Finder is, so it's done by the sort of Gallup organization, or two people who work for the Gallup organization, who've done lots of surveys of lots of different organizations. And the idea of this book is they've come up with something like 30-ish or 36 signature strengths. And when you read the book, there's like a survey that you fill out and you come up with sort of top 5 signature strengths. And the theory behind this is that all of us should be sort of focusing more on our strengths than our weaknesses. Because we can keep working on the weaknesses, but really, they'll never be our strengths. And actually, the more that we can apply our strengths, the better that will be in whatever situation that we're at. And I'll give you a couple of examples from the book. So, Woo is the strength, and it's about winning others over. So you probably know these sorts of people that can walk into a room, make friends like that. They're the people that can really sell new ideas and get buy-in from other stakeholders who may be outside of the sort of team. You kind of need those people with that strength in some certain situations. You have sort of these people who are intellectual, and maybe you might recognize this in yourself, which are the people who really need to think about problems, who think about all the possibilities and all the technical difficulties of what might happen. They're sort of trying to understand all the different possibilities. This is actually at odds with somebody who might have the achiever strength. So achievers are those people who just want to get stuff done. They get that whole satisfaction of sort of getting to a green bar after a red bar. They want to see the story completed across the Kanban board to done and signed off and released into production. And all of these people have different strengths at different times. So if you're thinking about sort of pair programming arrangements, often intellection and achievers are kind of at odds with each other. And these are also sources of conflict. And it's not necessarily bad, but it's useful to be aware. So if you have somebody who's wanting to get stuff done, and you have somebody who really just wants to think about a problem for a long time, they need to understand that people have different strengths, and that it's not about them inherently being bad, it's just different approaches to things. And there are different times in a project where you need to use these strengths. So for instance, if you're adopting a new technology, something that's very risky, you probably don't want people to sort of focus on just getting stuff done, because you want to think about what are all the possible risks. So what are the possible things that we might need to spike out a sort of test for and experiment with before we actually commit to doing stuff? But at the same time, we all have to deliver software. We mostly probably all work in commercial organizations, and we have to deliver software to people as well. So we can't just spend that time constantly thinking. We also have to turn that into action. And this is where, as a tech lead, we want to be aware of what our strengths are as a team, and that we're a lot stronger as a group. The great thing about this idea is that we don't have to necessarily be strong at everything. It's impossible to be strong at everything. And so as a tech lead, it's great to sort of make sure that you have a diverse group and that you don't get to that whole thing where we have that monoculture. And there are studies that prove this out. So from a commercial perspective, there's actually a lot of research that talk about what are the female representations on boards at organizations and what are their performances. So this is a 2007 study that shows actually when you have a mixed group, you actually end up with better performance as a company. And a more recent one, which was in 2012, was showing an increased sort of return on equity from 12 to 16% when you have a lot more of a diverse group. And that's only one element of diversity. So if we think about different backgrounds, different educational levels, sort of, I guess, different interests, the great thing about software is that people come from so many different places, history and art, technology, science. We can all tap into that because people have different ways of approaching the problem. And this book is a really great example. Scott Page, really great sort of thinker on sort of model thinking. And he wrote a book called The Difference, and it has a kind of complex model about how you actually calculate strength and diversity. And his mathematical model, I don't understand, I'll be honest. But he talks about how the collective accuracy of a group is sort of the function of the average accuracy of the people. So if we have good people in that field, we'll end up with a better solution. And how diverse is that group? So if we end up with people who are sort of computer scientists and engineers, if we actually have a little bit more of a diverse group who understand the problem, we'll end up with better solutions in general. But the key to this is if we can actually integrate these solutions. So if we go back to that sort of beginning point where everyone's working in 12 different directions, we actually end up with a lot more pain as a sort of development group than if we can actually find a way forward. And so our role as a tech lead is trying to surface these different opinions, different approaches, and finding ways that we can actually benefit from all of these different problem-solving techniques. So yeah, I think it's a really key thing that we need to think about. What sort of people have we got in our group? And this kind of actually means spending time with people, talking about their interests. We talked about respect before, and although I'm a big believer in sort of, team kind of building events and stuff like that, it's actually the little things that make a big difference about people every day. So you don't have to go away for a team building event and suddenly you're an amazing team. It's actually the little things that happen every day that bring people together. And so one of the sort of advices that I give to new tech leads is thinking about how do you, as a tech lead, encourage people to build trust on a daily basis. Little things like bringing in food and sort of being considerate and empathic. These little actions actually build team morale and build stronger teams as a result. And as a tech lead, we have an ability to influence this. So my favorite model for understanding people is one from Flow. It's also a book, lots of books to read. And it talks about this model about challenge and skill and ability. So let's assume that none of you have ever done any sort of data science type stuff. And I've given you suddenly a task to mine all the information that we've had for the last 5 years from our company and come up with a recommendation about what we should implement as a new feature going forward that will have a big impact on the commercial bottom line. You might start to think, ooh, I don't really know anything about that. I don't even know anything about the data and where I'd even start with this sort of stuff. We get anxious. But at the same time, if you're all, say, web programmers and I ask you to build yet another HTML page, you'll kind of end up in this state of boredom. And what's interesting is that we sort of fluctuate between these things depending on where we are and what we're actually given to do. And so this is the state of flow. So you might recognize this when you've learned something new. We've been given a challenge, and it's like, ooh, I'm not so sure about this. But when we solve this challenge, we get that little buzz, woo, that dopamine kick. We've solved something, we've learned something. But if we're given the same task daily, day in, day out, we'll get to a state of boredom. So we actually kind of need something new in order to bring us back into this state of flow. And so this cycle kind of continues. And what's interesting about this is that everyone has different backgrounds, everyone has different interests, and we can all have different sort of tasks that sort of get us into a state of constant flow. So what might be boring to somebody on the team may actually be, as Dave Farley said, really interesting to somebody else on the team because they've never done it before. So there's lots of opportunities for learning constantly on the sort of teams that we have. And as a tech lead, I'm not really advocating you to sort of tell people which tasks to do, but you can help people connect with new interesting opportunities in the same environment because there's such a mix of different things going on. And so when I think about the people side to the tech lead, it's really thinking about how do I maximize the potential from the people that we're working with. And so one of the great things about thinking about each individual in your team is thinking about things like, what are their skills? What do they have now in their experience? What are their strengths? So get them a copy of this book or get them to understand a little bit more about themselves and talk to people about what their strengths are. Help people understand if they have goals. So is their goal to become the next best sort of HTML designer, or do they want to go in more directions of sort of back-end type stuff? And maybe what are their interests outside of work? So perhaps they work on open source projects, and maybe one day might end up being useful to the sort of projects that we're at. And what we're trying to do is help people connect to kind of things that might hit their sweet spot. So things that they're good at, that they are sort of helping them work towards their goal, and the things that they have some experience in, so they don't get too anxious. And so we, as sort of tech leads, can actually create this environment and help people connect to useful, interesting things. We can send people on training courses to develop skills. We can help people build interests in new areas by maybe sending them to conferences like this where they have new ideas. And we can also help people establish goals. So if anyone has done sort of the grow, the goals, reality, options, way forward, these are really useful models that you can use with each individual in your team to help them individually grow. But we can't really do anything to sort of influence strengths, but we can at least build awareness of that. And there's lots of things we can do to help get people learning. So I think in some of the other sessions there's that talk about learning is the bottleneck or the constraint in software development. And we can do a lot to actually encourage people to amplify that learning. So there's tons of activities that we can actually do. So pair programming being the classic XP one. Lunchtime or brown bag sort of sessions. So get people who are passionate about a topic to present something to the rest of the people that they may not be aware of. Probably mob programming is another version of this, but team code reviews is really useful, right? So popping up some part of the code base and saying, hey, what does everyone think about this? There are opportunities here to learn as a group. What's great about today's day and age is that there's so many videos available online. So pick an interesting video once a week and set up a session where people can learn about something new. I think the videos from here will be online, so you can talk to people about some of these topics that are coming up. Even a focused sort of technical perspective around what are the things that are concerning people in the code base and what are the things that we'd like to continue forward that can help people establish better technical patterns. And maybe Spike showcases. So if anyone has done a Spike, the people who've worked on that Spike have probably learned something. But there's probably a lot of value in them showcasing their work and talking about what they've learned to the broader team, so you amplify that learning. The final point, which is maybe a little bit less pleasant about people, is about being aware of the bad apple. So this morning's keynote, there was a question about the toxic person. And it is something that you have to be really aware about. There's a paper which talks about bad is stronger than good. And it's this innate human aversion to having aversion to sort of bad experiences. And in this paper they actually say that we kind of need about 10 good experiences to negate the negative experience that we've had. And so one of the things as a tech lead is being aware of, if you have somebody in that team who is really toxic, you do want to think about how you treat them. So you don't want that sort of to spread and that sort of culture to continue throughout the team. And you kind of have that authority to remove people depending on your sort of position. So it's an option. I'm not saying that you should exercise it all the time as your first option. But it is something that you need to think about. We talked about programming, talking about people. Let's talk about some of the process. One of the first questions, which I think a lot of people get a bit hesitant about, is as a tech lead, is it okay to tell people what to do? And I would say yes, but sometimes. And there's a really great leadership model called the situation leadership model that talks about this. And so this talks about two things, one which is about how you support people and how you direct people. And you go through sort of different phases with this as you sort of work with people in your team. So the first one might be about directing. So this is a bit more about the telling people what to do type stuff. The next one might be about coaching. The next one's kind of about supporting. And the other one is finally sort of delegating. So where you're saying, okay, this thing might need to be tackled, but you're not saying exactly how it gets done, and you trust people. And what's really great about this model is it explains the context in which you should approach these different things, depending on the sort of task and the person and that sort of experience. So as a good example, if you're looking at sort of an individual, somebody who maybe is fresh from university is a really good example of this, where they're really eager to learn. They've graduated and they're really keen to do something, but they just don't know how to do stuff. So they don't really have that competence or skill and experience yet. And so this is where actually directing behavior could actually help them. So you might break down a particular task into sort of sub-things and help people actually get on with sort of doing a task. And if we go back to that sort of flow diagram, if we sort of just gave them the task, they'll get really anxious because they're like, oh, I'm not so sure how to approach this. So directing is actually an appropriate behavior in this kind of model. We move on to something like low to some competence and low commitment. And this is where you're helping people understand, okay, you might need to pair with different people to get the right skills, and here's the reason why it's important. So you're sort of coaching people into getting involved. The supporting behavior, which is somebody who is actually pretty good at sort of accomplishing a particular task, but maybe they're not so committed. So you might need to work with them to help them understand why it's really important and get that involved. And then the other end of the spectrum is the high competence and high commitment. And this is where it's like, there are stories on the Kanban board, and you know that if somebody picks it up who has this kind of skill set and they're really motivated, you don't really have to get involved so much. And so what's interesting about this model is that it's not about you and the person, it's actually about the people and the tasks and the sort of work at play. And it will always change because people have different skills in different areas. So somebody who you might have had to direct a little bit more in one area might actually be somebody you could delegate to for a different task. And so these are interesting models that we should sort of adopt. The sort of other model that I really like about sort of team formation on the people side is about Tuckmans. How many of you know Tuckmans here? Okay, it's a mix. It's quite an old model, but it kind of explains the whole stages of a team and how they go through. So to begin with, first we get a whole bunch of people together, and that's kind of the forming stage. So you are now a team. But not really. It takes a while. So everyone will start to understand, okay, these people have these strengths, these people approach problems really differently. And this is where you start to get into a storming phase. So this is where a lot of conflict happens. And often it's kind of the conflict that goes unresolved. So it's like, some people will prefer to avoid dealing with conflict, and these conflicts never really get resolved, so people will sort of always repeat those behaviors. And our responsibility as a tech lead is actually to try to get people through this phase. So, create a safe environment where people can talk about issues. So retrospectives are a great tool for this. And come up with principles about how you're going to work as a team. So if you've done like a sort of team chartering event, that's a really great way of sort of saying, what's the culture and our approach to the team? From a technical side, what's our technical principles about how we're approaching our code base? So, if we're doing sort of objects and methods, how big should they be? How do we structure our code base? These are things that we can do to sort of accelerate through this storming phase. If we can do this successfully, we get onto the kind of the norming phase, where we're actually establishing these principles. But in my experience, without good technical leadership, we don't really get to this sort of stage. You might end up with that situation where people are going off in lots of different directions, and a team never gets the benefit of that. And once you get through these norming phases, you've got these principles, actually this is when a team really performs. This is where the benefits of a team really come out. And this is where, what people say a team is much better than an individual, this is where actually a lot of that sort of stuff comes out. But it doesn't happen naturally. And so this is our responsibility, which is to help facilitate this process and to do it as quickly as possible. they revised this model a while ago because if you've been on sort of teams, end of a phase, you start moving on to different projects and make the team disbands, or maybe you don't have projects and it's the team continuing on, they actually recognize there's a different phase, which is this adjourning phase. And perhaps you kind of recognize this. Maybe it's when a team member has left and they go off to a different opportunity, or if it's when somebody joins. And actually what happens there is that there's a bit of a mourning phase, right? Maybe it's a celebration. People have like parties or cakes or beers. And actually what's really happening in this is this adjourning phase where people are kind of recognizing it's kind of the end of an era, it's a bit of a different phase. And my tip for you is one person can actually change the team dynamics tremendously, either when they leave or when they join. And what's actually happening is that you're creating sort of a new team again, because the responsibilities of somebody in that role, they've left, and now that needs to kind of be distributed again amongst the people. Or if somebody joins, they might be assuming that they're taking on responsibilities that other people have. So it's quite a difficult thing in our industry because we have quite a lot of change in our teams often. So in my experience, it's very common for people to sort of join or leave after 6 or 9 months, particularly in a team. And so you'll have to be aware of when this transition is happening. And you want to make sure that you're going through and accelerating this phase again. The interesting thing about all of this sort of stuff is these are all models. And I really love this quote from George E.P. Box, which essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. So think of this as a toolkit, and you're adding all these models to your toolkit and thinking about, can I use this at different times? Don't use these as prescriptive, this is what you must do in this role. And I think part of this process is, one interesting thing talking to a lot of tech leads is this challenge of being torn between the technical world and the people world, and all the things that drag you away from writing code. And I think part of this important part is actually making time for you. So I recommend that you actually block out time in your calendar thinking about what are the sort of longer term things about the team that you'd like to achieve are. And if you don't make time for this, you'll kind of end up reacting to lots of different things all the time. And it can kind of feel like this, where it's just, you're constantly in meetings, you constantly have lots of things to do. And what you really need to get to is some time where you can sort of get to your Zen time, right? Which is thinking about, what's the thing I can do this week that has a long-term impact on the team and the people that I'm working with? Unlike code, where you can sort of write something and you get that fast feedback, unfortunately when you deal with sort of teams and people, the feedback loop is a lot longer. So stuff that you might have done this week may not actually pay back for 2, 3, 4 weeks, because people are people, and that's kind of complicated. So make sure that you spend some time doing that. And so here's a sample of how I've sometimes managed time, which is actually sort of getting some planning time in sort of at the end of the day or at the end of the week to sort of thinking about what am I doing as a tech lead to increase my sort of understanding or the team's understanding of the architectural vision? Or what am I doing to help get the team more formed as a group and dealing with some of the more technical issues? And some people actually block out coding time as well. So they make sure that they have some time to either be pairing with somebody or doing some code reviews and spending some time in the code base. I know a colleague who would block out all of Monday, for instance, and not accept any meetings. And it's just kind of a known state because it's important for them to make sure that they have some time in the code. So technical leadership is hard, but the rewards are really worth it. So as a developer, what's really interesting is that you kind of have sort of the ability to influence a small part of the code base. And that may actually be used by lots of people. But as a tech lead, if you help each of your developers sort of get much better, you're actually having a much more positive influence over a wider set of the code base than what you could as a single developer. And if you sort of think about the environment of when you were a developer, or still are a developer, and you think about, I wish our team acted like that, one of the great things with this role is that you have the ability to influence all of that, and therefore make everyone's lives as developers much better as well, and much more productive. Okay, thank you.
We have question time. We have prize question time. One hand up very quickly over there. Based on the stage. Hang on a second. I think that gentleman got his hand up first.
Based on your experiences, what do you think the ideal team size is?
Based on my experience, what's the ideal team size? So I'm a big believer in a sort of 5 ± 2 kind of thing. I think it's a good level. You can kind of increase further, but I think the more you do that, you just add a lot more sort of communication overhead. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks.
Gentleman on stage there.
Okay, so at the beginning of the talk, you brought up an article which you pulled a nice quote out of. I was kind of skim reading the first paragraph, and there was a not so nice quote in there about how developers have a typical mindset of being, arrogant, full-minded, egocentric. It continued on for a while after that.
He's a good journalist.
Yeah, okay. Well, you've talked a lot about diversity in teams. Does that mean you don't recognise that as a common trait, or do you think these two things overlap? That that's a common trait and there's also these differences?
I mean, I think that everyone's different. So I think at some point, I was an arrogant developer as well, right? At some point, you're passionate about the stuff that you are. And so part of that comes across as proudness. And, I think very early in your career, I know a lot of people, they go from being like, bright stars in university and then they hit the workforce. And it's a completely different world. Like, the sort of development environments that you work in and the experience of some of the different technical problems that you deal with is really hard. But I think people go through different cycles. So somebody who's maybe arrogant today may have learned differently, or as somebody gets more and more specialized, maybe they become more arrogant because they have that expertise, and so they're relied on more as a result. So I think people can be both of those things. But I guess part of it is just making sure that as a tech lead, that people can work together and that arrogance is sort of moved to the side.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
What's the other chap on stage?
You mentioned that you came from a developer background, so you shifted to tech lead. How was for you actually when your time coding was getting down? How was you coping with that? When you have less time coding, and since you have only 30% of your time coding right now, how do you do to keep up with technology and still keeping good influence?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the first one about dealing with the move from coding to not coding, or more direction of not coding, is, to be honest, not very good. My first experience. You have that whole thing where delegation isn't a natural skill that we get trained in, right? So it's like, but I want to write the code, and I want to write the really interesting stuff and solve problems, because that's kind of the satisfaction that you get as a developer. But I think what was really comforting is that you're not the only person that's been through this journey, and you're not the only person struggling with this. And so I think it's finding some balance of that. So recognizing that because my time's not going to be spent full time on the problems, I shouldn't take on the hardest, riskiest problems, because I'm going to get dragged away to other things. And so it's actually recognizing that I'm a big risk to the project if I do that as well. I think, and I think that's one sort of aspect. I think finding and making sure that you have some time is the other sort of side to it. I forgot part 2 of your question.
Yeah, the other question is about how do you do to keep up to date since you have less time?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, I've written sort of systems in sort of Perl back in the day, to Java and .NET, to Ruby and JavaScript. And actually one interesting thing that I found is that I've had a lot of comfort because I've spent a lot of time thinking about what are the things that are transferable. So good code in general is good code regardless of whichever language you took it. So short, consistent, well-structured sort of programs, they maybe look a little bit different in whichever language, but you still like smaller methods over larger methods, for instance. And so one of the comforting factors is actually knowing and focusing on the skills that are transferable. So testing and refactoring and sort of continuous delivery, that sort of behaviors are transferable. So I don't feel like I miss out. And actually, the tools that we use today, in 2 years' time, are going to be replaced again. And so I think part of it is this willingness of learning new tools and trying to understand how your mental model fits the old concepts into those sorts of tools. So, the new build or scripting tool may not be Maven or Ant or something like that in the Java world, maybe Ruby now, or all these different things. So I think it's just being comfortable with that sort of stuff. And then making sure that when you have your team, you have the good mix of skills. So, if you are, I wouldn't ever recommend that everyone sort of goes away and picks a whole team of people who have no idea about the programming platform that you have. You need some people who have that experience, but you as a tech lead can help amplify that skill across the group. And so pair programming, I find, is a really good way of doing that, where somebody who's a bit more experienced in a particular tool starts to spread some of that stuff. And that sort of learning activity slide where I said about transmitting that sort of stuff, that's a really great way of getting a lot more knowledge out in that team. And you as a tech lead benefit from that as well. Side projects are also fun. Like I still kind of hack away at different things, but it won't ever be the same level as what it would be in a real project.
Cool.
So a lot of teams I work with. So I'm a developer kind of moving into that tech lead space as and when. I'm quite keen to head in that direction. But a lot of the teams we work with are sort of more contractors or large corporate companies. A lot of what you're talking about seems to be heavily invested in people. It seems like a lovely strategy, but if the people are leaving in 6 months or 12 months, or you have no guarantee that they're likely to stick around. It seems risky, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's more of a question, I guess, about your organization. And I guess the opportunity with the tech lead is you often get involved in sort of the sourcing of people on your team. And so these are conversations to have with the people who are saying you can't hire permanents, but you have to hire contractors. Is that, we're investing in people, and we want to continue doing that regardless of what sort of people are on our team. And it's a cost to the business for them to have contractors in rather than permanents if those people are leaving again.
So, in your experience, do you think there's a leadership void in the software industry because the seemingly right people for the tech lead jobs are reluctant to step up into that role because they don't want to sit in meetings all day? And if so, is that something we can do to change it a bit so that we can encourage them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's getting better. I think software as an industry is pretty young compared to other industries. And so I am starting to see a lot more people write books around this sort of stuff. There's another book called Leading Snowflakes, which talks about how everyone's unique and understanding different approaches to leading snowflakes because everyone will take that style very differently. And there's another conference that I'm speaking at next week, which is called the Lead Developer Conference, which is in London. And I'm starting to see a lot more people talk about leadership in general. I think what's interesting is that it's very easy, particularly in architecture conferences, only to focus on the tools and techniques, and actually less about the sort of broader, sort of softer side, although I would actually say they're kind of the harder problems of dealing with the people side as an architect or a tech lead. I think we're getting better. I think we still have a lot more to do. I think the other thing that we can do in our sort of own organizations is to champion a track for technical development. So the fact that the leadership stuff and a technical leadership stuff is an important thing to have in that you need to invest in training and time where technical people need to have opportunities to learn this as well.
Further questions? Lady at the back.
Often people are concerned about taking on, following on from that question really, the technical lead roles, because they worry about becoming a mouthpiece for an organisation to the team. How do you find that challenge, and have you got any tips for people who may have those concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things, and Jim Highsmith talks a lot about adaptive leadership, and in what he talks about is about writing paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes that we write as a tech lead is that we have to be technical, but we have to do non-technical things as well. And we're constantly at tension between this. And you can't really choose one or the other. So if we choose to sort of just focus on the business and the planning side, we'll lose sort of touch with the technical side and then start making ill-formed choices. And I think part of the thing is trying to find that right balance between that. So recognizing the tension's there and that it's okay, it's just part of the role. But it's doable, and you need to find out ways of actually doing that, which will depend on the situation and the people. Yeah.
Just as a quick straw poll, those of you that are technical, stick your hands up. And keep your hands up if you take a tech lead role. So the anxiety is not really there then, from that point of view, in terms of just the audience here.
Oh, it's good to hear.
That's pretty cool. So further questions? Gentleman there.
Yeah, where does Scrum Master fit in all this? Is it anti-pattern?
I can have a whole talk about Scrum. So roles are roles. And for me, roles are collections of responsibilities. And you might split some of those. So, Scrum is very defined about what the responsibilities of the Scrum Master should be. that doesn't equate to people. So, you know, a tech lead might still play a sort of Scrum Master role. I'd actually encourage people to rotate the Scrum Master role because it creates a bit of balance and it gets new people developing new skills, which is, if we go back to that sort of flow diagram, helps build people and maximize the potential. But I think it's a complementary thing. So I think the question will be about the timing, because other responsibilities will mean that you'll have less time to take care of other tech lead responsibilities. But actually one good thing I really like that I've learned over time is thinking about feature-driven development's not really talked about a lot in the Agile space. But one of the interesting practices out of the feature-driven development methodology is talking about feature leads. And so actually I use that quite a lot, particularly when working with larger teams, where you know, you have lots of different things going on. You can't, as a sort of tech lead, think about all those possible directions. So you might start to delegate some of those responsibilities and say, okay, somebody in the team is responsible for this area of the code base, which is maybe about the authorization, authentication systems, or the area about monitoring and things like that. And you kind of allocate feature leads, and so you delegate a bit more of that responsibility, but you still work with them on sort of doing some of that stuff. And I think for me that's another good example of that sort of role sort of being split and distributed, and that should free up more of your time.
I think our last question in the middle somewhere.
So, I'm more or less in the same position of the colleague over there. And the question I have is that I love the message that tech leads should code with people who know what's actually happening in the field. Do you have any tips on how to make tech lead to find this time to be able to spend with you?
Yeah, so I find actually pair programming is one of the best ways of doing it, because depending on your pair, like I don't believe in 100% everyone should be pair programming all the time. It's quite exhausting. And I think there's a lot of value in sort of doing a lot of the pair collaboration and the design of something, the approach, and then the constant feedback. And actually that's actually a model that works really well as a tech lead, which is you can sort of sit down with somebody before they start a new story, you talk about the approach, you agree on how you're going to do that, and you might end up doing something else, and you come back and sort of pair program with them a bit. And that actually works quite well as a tech lead to sort of deal with some of that stuff. And you still find some of that time to code. Another approach, if you're not pair programming, is to sort of work out what are the small things that you might work on. So code reviews is a really great way of doing that. So, you know, the whole Git flow type stuff, you know, you might be doing the code reviews asynchronously, so that actually works quite well as well. You get to read a lot more code, you don't probably get to write as much code, but you still want to find opportunities to write code, and then take kind of those non-critical tasks or stories. So things that are kind of maybe, you know, maybe not so the most exciting things for you, but actually help you still stay in the code.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's all we've got time for from Patrick. Can we thank him in the usual way?